Al Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York on January 17, 1899, to Gabriel and Teresa Alphonse, who immigrated to the United States in 1893 from a small town called Castellamare di Stabia, 16 miles from Naples, Italy. Capone came from a big family. He was the fourth of 7 sons and $2 to a family he would later make infamous and famous all at the same time. Capone dropped out of the New York public school system at the age of 14 after being expelled from school 133 times. After dropping out, he joined a couple local area gangs while working odd jobs around Brooklyn until a gangster came into his life by the name of Johnny Torrio, who the young Capone regarded as a mentor. The gangster Johnny Torrio was to be the first stepping stone to Capone's rise to power. Capone's life of crime began early. As a teenager, he joined 2 gangs, the Brooklyn Rippers and the 40 Thieves Juniors, and engaged in a lot of different types of petty crime. After his initial stint with small-time gangs, Capone joined the notorious 5 Points gang, headed by Frankie Yale. It was at this time that he began working as a bartender and a bouncer at Yale's establishment, the seedy Harvard Inn. It was there Capone got the scars that gave him the nickname Scarface. Various stories have circulated that attempts to explain the name. One story is that when he was working as a waiter for a young couple, he leaned down and said to the woman, "Honey, you have a nice ass, and I mean that as a compliment." Her brother Frank Galucio pulled a knife and slashed Capone in the face 3 times before leaving the bar with his sister. Word of the fight eventually reached Yale, who forced Capone to apologize to Galucio. Another story is that he asked a Sicilian barber to give him a particular style of haircut popular with Sicilian gangsters, and the barber refused, perhaps because Capone was not a Neapolitan, upon which Capone vandalized the shop, knocking down a row of personalized shaving mugs belonging to customers, and the barber then slashed his face with a straight razor. This incident caused Yale to take Capone under his wing and eventually led to his rule over the Chicago outfit. It is speculated that Capone forgave Frank Galucio and even hired him as a bodyguard later in his career. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, popularly known as Al Capone, was an American gangster who led a crime syndicate dedicated to the smuggling and bootlegging of liquor and other illegal activities, such as brothels, during the Prohibition era of the 1920s and 30s. Capone began his career in Brooklyn before moving to Chicago and becoming the boss of the criminal organization known as the Chicago Outfit, although his business card reportedly described him as a used furniture dealer. By the end of the 1920s, Capone had gained the attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation following his being placed on the Chicago Crime Commission's Public Enemies list. Although never successfully convicted of racketeering charges, Capone's criminal career ended in 1931 when he was indicted and convicted by the federal government for Prohibition was an infamous time in American history that is often thought of as silly or wasteful. It is often referred to as the Great Experiment. Herbert Hoover, the President of the United States when Prohibition was enacted, said, "Our country has deliberately undertaken a great social and economic experiment, noble in motive and far-reaching in purpose. It was an experiment after all, an experiment in ridding America of alcoholic beverages. It was undertaken to reduce crime and corruption, solve social problems, reduce the tax burden created by prisons and poorhouses, and improve health and hygiene in America. However, after 13 years, Prohibition was over, and the results that reformers hoped to see were not visible, and it seemed as though the situation was made worse. Although Prohibition seemed like a great idea when the drafters of the 18th Amendment added it to the Constitution, in the end, it seemed to be a great letdown. Prohibition is described as several periods during which the manufacturing, transportation, import, export, and sale of alcoholic beverages were restricted or illegal. America underwent Prohibition from January 16, 1920 to February 17, 1933. Interestingly, America was not the only country to experience Prohibition in the 20th century. The other areas affected by Prohibition included Prince Edward Island in Canada and other locations in Canada were under Prohibition from 1901 to 1948. Finland was also under Prohibition from 1919 to 1932. Iceland prohibited alcohol from 1915 to 1922, and beer was not allowed to be sold until 1989. Many states in India went through periods of prohibition from 1950 to the year 2000. The word prohibition can refer to any law banning the sale and consumption of alcohol, in particular local laws that have the same effect. The prohibition of something is the widespread banning of something, whether it be alcohol, drugs, or any other item found unacceptable by a majority. I find it interesting that when many people hear the word prohibition, they automatically think of the time period in American history when alcohol was banned. However, there are still movements today to prohibit alcohol sales, and some people wish to start a prohibition on the sale. The 18th Amendment had banned the sale, transportation, and manufacture of alcohol in America, but it was clear to some that millions neither wanted this law nor would respect it. There was obviously a huge market for what in the 1920s was an illegal commodity. It was the gangsters who dominated various cities who provided this commodity. Each major city had its gangster element, but for the most famous was Chicago with Al Capone. Capone was public enemy number one. He had moved to Chicago in 1920, where he worked for Johnny Torrio, the city's leading figure in the underworld. Capone was given the task of intimidating Torrio's rivals within the city so that they would give up and hand over to Torrio their territory. Capone also had to convince speakeasy operators to buy illegal alcohol from Torrio. Capone was very good at what he did. In 1925, Torrio was nearly killed by a rival gang, and he decided to get out of the criminal world while he was still alive. Torrio handed over to Capone his business. Within 2 years, Capone was earning $60 million a year from alcohol sales alone. Other rackets earned him an extra $45 million a year. The Prohibition era of the 1920s was a gangster's paradise, and Capone had always shown promise. Young, brash, intelligent, loyal, and willing to kill, never without reason. Prohibition turned organized crime into lucrative business. America was clamoring for respite after the atrocities of World War I. For most, Chicago was a rough city during the Prohibition, yet for others like Capone, there was a fortune to be made for those with the Constitution and iron will to grab it. Capone's boss, Johnny Torrio, had a stranglehold on the beer market in 1921. Chicago had 8 breweries working full-time, supplying the thirsty throats of the city's parched. While Torrio controlled most of the south side, Dion Dini O'Banion owned much of the north side of Chicago. O'Banion was loved and respected by his friends and feared by his enemies. It's said that O'Banion had personally killed more than 50 people himself. During the Prohibition era, the lucrative business of distributing alcohol became big business for Al Capone and his organization. Capone did not just distribute alcohol to businesses in Chicago. He transported them to other nearby states surrounding Chicago, such as its neighbors, Indiana and Ohio. By small plane and box trucks, alcohol was sold to most of the taverns and pubs in the state of Ohio. As you can see on the map, Ohio is just one state over from Chicago, Illinois. Elliot Ness was born April 19, 1903 in Chicago, Illinois. In 1927, Ness accepted a position with the United States Department of the Treasury. Ness was assigned to Chicago, where he was to enforce Prohibition. Ness created an elite team of Treasury officers, nicknamed the Untouchables, to shut down the alcohol operations of gangster Al Capone. In 1934, Ness became the chief investigator of the Department of the Treasury's Bureau of Prohibition for Ohio. The next year, Prohibition ended, causing Ness to seek employment. This same year, he became the Director of Public Safety for Cleveland, Ohio. Ness took over police force in Cleveland that was known for its corruption. Under his leadership, the Cleveland Police Department dramatically improved and gained the respect of other departments across the United States. In 1942, Ness resigned. He worked briefly in Washington, D.C. before becoming the chairman of the Diebold Incorporated, a safe manufacturer in Canton, Ohio, in 1944. In 1947, he unsuccessfully ran for the Cleveland mayoral seat. This same year, the Diebold Corporation released Ness from the company. He then took a position with the Northridge Industrial in Pennsylvania. Ness died from a heart attack on May 16, 1950. There are plenty of brewing companies right here in the state of Ohio where Capone could have had his alcohol transported. We have just for examples, we have the Anheuser-Busch Company right here in Canton. We have the Worcester Brewing Company in Worcester, Ohio, and the Akron Brewing Company in the city of Akron, and all of these was all in operation back in the 1920s and 30s. This is a little bit about the Worcester Brewing Company in Worcester, Ohio. Around 1860, Joseph R. Ramseur built Worcester's first brewery for the production of both ale and lager beer. It was known at the time as the Apple Creek Brewery, standing just half a mile from the creek. Today the site is between East Lincoln Way, U.S. Route 30, and Sylvan Road. The brewery started a small enterprise in the 1860s, but was enlarged in the 1870s to size which it would retain for the next 40 years, producing between 2,000 and 2,500 barrels per year. In 1895, Grabber again sold the brewery, this time to Robert Wiseman of Chicago. In late 1903, the Akron Brewing Company was started at the same time. The state of Ohio's rural areas and miles of backcountry roads would have been perfect meeting spots back in the 1920s and 30s for Capone to deliver illegal goods to his customers in the state of Ohio. Miles of country roads and hollers surrounded by tall green trees would have given vehicles plenty of cover while unloading and reloading of trucks. The wide open spaces of big grassy fields in this state would have given small planes places to land while the tall trees gave them cover.